Hey everyone. On this episode, we looked at Earthbound by Ken Baumann. This is the first book in the Boss Fight book series, and it is a really great one. It's probably my favorite book that I've looked at for this series so far. I don't know if I've said that before, but whatever book I mentioned before being my favorite, this one is really my favorite. It's not a history book, it's not like a social issues book. This is more Ken talking about his experiences playing Earthbound for a second time and kind of recalling what it was like to play it the first time, as well as tying different parts of the game to experiences that he's had throughout his life. Now, there are a lot of times in this book where Ken kind of brings up some like nostalgia trips that he had while he was playing this, and it gave me a bunch of those too, just from reading them and seeing some of his experiences of, how he went to a video game, or not a video game store, but went to a rental store when he was growing up, and how certain movies affected his life, and kind of other things that were going on around the same time that he was playing Earthbound, or different things that he did growing up that relate to the video game. I kind of felt like I could do the same thing. Like, as I'm reading this book, I'm like, oh, I did that, or, I remember doing something similar to that. Or, specifically when he mentions he could, like, basically rent any movie that he liked, it made me remember back to when I would go out and rent movies, not from like a Blockbuster or anything like that, but I would rent them from an actual general store in our town, and this lady gave zero fucks about what I rented. I could rent anything. I think I was like 9 or 10 and I'm renting like slasher films. Just like, alright, yeah, sure, there you go. Maybe my mom like talked to her at some point, I don't really know, but that's just one thing that this book made me reflect on, because we had that one similar instance in our childhood where we could just like rent any movie that we wanted. So sort of playing off that little thing there that I gave you where Ken talked a little bit about his childhood and I went off on my annoying tangent as I usually do, Ken talks a lot about trying to recreate the atmosphere of playing the game when he was a little kid. This can be kind of hard to do, especially when you're a grown-up, where I could do a similar thing. It's kind of not really the same, but Ken talks a lot about trying to get back in that same mindset of, sitting on the floor in his living room while he's playing the game, having his drink in just the right spot where he would have had it when he was a kid, that sort of thing, and talking about how it was just a childhood experience that he had where he played Earthbound with his brother, and then he talks a little bit about two other childhood experiences where Shigeru Miyamoto used to like go exploring in caves, and that sort of inspired him to make Legend of Zelda, and also the creator of Earthbound, whose name I'm just gonna absolutely butcher here. Sorry, one second. Shigesato Itoi, how he saw a movie when he was growing up, and how he says the movie inspired him, or at least had some influence on him when he was watching, when he created Earthbound. While I was reading this book, it kind of got me thinking, I've never really played another retro RPG like Earthbound. There are a lot of weird ones out there, but on the Super Nintendo, I've never really seen anything like it. And we get into a little bit later, I'm just going to go ahead and jump ahead, where Ken is talking about trying to find another piece of media that matches up with what he experienced with Earthbound. Like, if somebody saw like a movie or listened to a song or read a book or something like that that matches up with Earthbound. And I started thinking about sort of the SNES library, or at least the part of it that I have, and I was thinking there's another game that came out around the same time as Earthbound called Secret of Evermore, and the only parts in that that really match up with Earthbound is a lot of the pop culture stuff, because Earthbound's supposed to be set in a weird interpretation of the United States, and Evermore uses a lot of, in this case, fake pop culture references, but still references to US pop culture. Ken also goes into something else that I thought was really interesting, and that's sort of the idea behind Earthbound of a bunch of small children going off to fight some kind of a greater evil. And he mentions it similar to like going off to fight the boogeyman. And I kind of thought that was like a really good example of how this is a pretty different RPG. Usually you didn't see a lot of like the kids, at least Ness's age, or at least the way Ness is portrayed to be in this, you didn't see a lot of very younger kids going off to fight. And I kind of thought about some of the enemies that were in Earthbound where you're fighting like inanimate objects. So like you're fighting a clock, you're fighting a stop sign, you're fighting a tent, and it gets to that really weird idea of like when you're a kid and everything's really dark in your room, there's no lights, and you can see stuff that's not there, and you can see a lamp across the room and you can think that doesn't look right, like that looks evil or sinister. And that's kind of something that plays into Earthbound a little bit as you're this group of children that are going off to fight this big bad evil. And that sort of plays into some weird stuff with retro RPGs and RPGs in general, where it's like none of the adults can do anything in the story. They have to rely on these kids to go save them for some reason, but whatever. That doesn't have anything to do with the book. That was just my own personal thoughts on, like, for all RPG genre in general. Ken also touches on Tom Bissell's book, Extra Lives, and he uses that to sort of explain how video game literature and everything has changed and how it gave him a different perspective on video games in general. I've reviewed Tom's book for this series. I'll put that in a link in the description below. One thing I thought was really nice is Ken talks a little bit about his own research that he did for this book, where he went online to find walkthroughs and also research different parts of the game that he was going to need basically in order to complete it. And this is not something I've seen a whole lot in other books that I've read for this series, but it's something that I think more authors should do, because the fan communities for a lot of these games have done much more research than they could ever hope to do. Like, in some cases, decades of research on games to find out all the hidden secrets, give all their own personal theories, give all the lore to the game, and it's something that really should be used more, at least in video game literature. So we get into the marketing of Earthbound, which I thought was kind of an interesting thing to talk about, because Earthbound is one of those games where it didn't do very well at launch, but it found a much greater audience in sort of like the secondary market. And if you even go online now, you can just see the people that are trying to get a couple $100 for just a loose cartridge. Ken talks a lot about this in the book, and mostly because the game only sold 200,000 copies, where Nintendo thought maybe we could get a couple million copies out of this. And one, confusing marketing and sort of like the gross out marketing that was combined with it didn't really help the game out. But I know I'm looking back in hindsight on this, but these were some of the games that were released at the same time as Earthbound. Now, these aren't just Super Nintendo games. I'm going to cover like PlayStation and PC games as well. But this is the murderer's row of games that were released in 1995 alongside Earthbound. Chrono Trigger, Donkey Kong Country 2, Command & Conquer, TIE Fighter, Mortal Kombat 3, Mega Man 7, Mega Man X3, Phantasy Star 4, Street Fighter Alpha, Castlevania Dracula X, Tekken 2, Twisted Metal, Suikoden, Final Fight 3, and Secret of Evermore. I can kind of see why the game didn't do too well, because it probably just got lost with all of the other stuff that was released at that time. When I looked up, because I was really curious why Earthbound got kind of lost in the shuffle, aside from like the weird marketing, the fact that it was sold with its Player's Guide, which added, I think, like another $20 to it. It didn't have any room to breathe with all the other stuff that was coming out. I literally started laughing when I saw like all the games that were released in 1995. I think a lot of it had to do with marketing and just the fact that it was sold with its Player's Guide, which usually wasn't done for a Super Nintendo game. It's just a weird coincidence, I think, that just all these games came out at the same time and a bunch of other stuff factored into it. I'd need somebody much smarter than me to really go through this and then look at really why Earthbound didn't do as well as it probably should have. So after another really annoying rant, which I'm sure you guys probably didn't really appreciate, we transition into Ken and him talking about the parallels between his own life and Ness's life. Both Ken and Ness had fathers that they didn't really talk to except for over the phone. For Ness, it's because his dad is off on a business trip or something like that. I can't exactly remember why. But for Ken, it was because he was pursuing his acting career while he was growing up. So he lived in Los Angeles and in New York. So you see kind of the similarities, whereas Ness's dad is on a business trip. This time it's Ken that's on a business trip. And you have each of them communicating with their respective parents over the phone instead of like actually seeing them in person. It's a really nice touch to add this story in here because it just adds something more to the book where you can kind of relate a little bit more with what Ken was feeling at the time when he was replaying this game, and you can sort of get into like what was happening in his mind while he was playing. Then we get into the Sword of Kings, which is one of the weird things about this book. I can see how everyone that has played an RPG or played like an MMO has had this exact same experience that Ken has, where you're just grinding away for this one item that you need to complete the game, and it's a rare drop and you just keep struggling to get it, or it's that one boss that occasionally drops a piece of loot that you want, and you just keep plugging away until you eventually get it. I got that same feeling from reading Ken's experience trying to get the Sword of Kings, and him recalling, like, how the heck did I do this when I was a kid? And you have, like, that little seed of doubt in your mind, like, did I do this when I was a kid? Like, did I have someone help me? Was it just a point where I got fed up and moved on? Or is it something that I really plowed through? I've had that when I've gone back and played other RPGs and other retro games. And it's kind of funny to see Ken have that here with the Sword of Kings. And it's just this really fun moment in the book. It just adds on to all the other stuff that I liked about this book. So now we get to the end of the book, and this was the one that really, I think, affected me the most. This chapter was just really, really crazy. And it's Ken putting his own fight with Crohn's disease next to the fight against Gygas at the very end, where he shows different things that happened to him during this. Ken basically almost died from Crohn's disease because he didn't know he had it, wasn't taking care of himself, and eventually had to have multiple surgeries to basically get himself back to normal. And you can compare that to a lot of the things that happen at the end of Earthbound, where you get your soul transplanted into a robot and you're not sure that they're going to be able to put you back into your regular body, so it's kind of like the death of your physical form, but your mind is living on in this robot. And you go on to fight Gygas, and there's those moments where you're not sure that you're going to make it, similar to how Ken is writing in this book, where he wasn't sure he was going to make it, and he actually talked to his wife about, we need to talk about what happens when I die, or if I die. and you just see these two parallels through both the game and through Ken's life experience. And this was kind of a downer to read, but it was like, well, at least I know he made it out okay at the end because he's writing the book, obviously. It's just something that really struck home with me while I was reading it, and I really, really love this chapter. If you only read one part of this book, definitely read this chapter that Ken writes about his fight with Crohn's disease and comparing that to beating Earthbound. It's really, really amazing to read. My final thoughts on the book. This is an outstanding book. It's definitely been my favorite of all the books that I've read so far. It's just really a testament to how great of a writer Ken actually was. Because, like I mentioned, when you write a book, you want to get some kind of an emotion out of somebody. And this kind of ran the gambit of emotions for me. It pulled at like my nostalgic feelings for like my own childhood. It made me feel really bad about what was going on with Ken, but knowing that there's going to be something afterwards, it really just grabbed a hold of me and pulled a lot out. And it's just a really, really great book. I strongly recommend this one. If you could only read one of the boss fight books, one of their books, definitely read Earthbound. It's a great way to get you into maybe reading some of the other ones that they've done, and it's a great way to get you into reading at least some of the other literature out there for video games. It's not a history book, like I said, but it's one of the better books about video game history and about the people that play video games. So that's going to wrap it up, guys. I'm really glad that I was able to read this book for this and present this review to you. Please let me know what you think in the comments below. I'll also throw in a link to the Tom Bissell Extra Lives review that I did, just in case you guys want to check that out, as I mentioned it earlier. I'll talk to you all later, and have a great day.